Okay.
Okay.
So welcome everybody to the discussion groups that we've been running on South Asian philosophy this term. And today our speaker is Professor Anantanand Rambachan, who is Professor of Religion, Philosophy, and Asian Studies at Saint Olaf College, Minnesota. Professor Rambachan is the author of several books, book chapters, and articles in scholarly journals. Among his books are The Limits of Scripture, The Advaita Worldview, God, World, and Humanity, The Hindu Vision, and The Hindu Theology of Liberation. His writings include a series of commentaries on the Ramayana, and 25 of his lectures were part of a series transmitted by the BBC around the world. Professor Rambachan has been involved in the field of interreligious relations and dialogue for over 25 years. As a Hindu participant and analyst, he has contributed to numerous consultations and discussions convened by national and international organizations concerned with interreligious issues. He is very active in the dialogue programs of the World Council of Churches and was a Hindu guest and participant in the last 4 General Assemblies of the World Council of Churches. Today, he will be speaking on the topic of, are there principles in the Hindu tradition consonant with freedom, dignity, and equality? B.R. Ambedkar and Liberation from Caste. So I'll just pass on to him to get started.
Thank you very much, Sruta Kirti, and thank you very much, members of your discussion group for inviting me to have this dialogue, to have this conversation with you. It's an honor to be here together with all of you. Thank you. So the question that frames the subject of my lecture today is a critical one. The question actually comes from the writings of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. Are there principles in the Hindu tradition consonant with freedom, dignity, and equality? I want to say at the very beginning that my approach to this subject matter is what I will describe as a theological approach. The discipline that I identify myself most closely with because of my own study and training is theology. I do self-describe as a Hindu theologian. To distinguish my study of religion or the methodology of my study of religion from important other ways, and particularly from the social sciences, anthropology or sociology, and so on. So in this presentation to you today, I will not attempt to account for the origins or the historical development of the caste system. There are, of course, many abundant studies that offer theories and suggestions about this. But the fact is, and this is for me the important issue, whatever might be its historical origin, the system evolved into a hierarchical and unequal ordering of human beings. As you know, if you're familiar, into 4 groups, major groups, of course. These are the savarnas, or those who are with caste, differentiated on the basis of birth, ritual purity, occupation, endogamy, rules of commensality, and so on. And so that hierarchy, just to quickly mention, is a triangular one. At the top you have the Brahmins, traditionally teachers, priests, scholars, and then following the Brahmins are the Kshatriyas, the warriors, political leaders, then the Vaishyas, or farmers, merchants, the Shudras, who are servants of all laborers. But the first 3 groups are in Sanskrit described as the twice born, or the Dvijas, because they alone were entitled to the rite of initiation, in Sanskrit called the Upanayana, which is a prerequisite to the traditional study of the scriptures or the Vedas. But this hierarchical order also led to the creation of a very large group of avarnas or outcasts, untouchables, most of them self-described as Dalits, who are considered ritually impure, unequal, denied all of the rights and privileges that were granted or which belonged to those at the upper levels of this system. So by the period 400 BCE or the 400 CE, standard features of caste were in place, especially features of untouchability that I have already mentioned, which include physical segregation, non-commensality, endogamy, and so on. The Vedas are not to be studied in villages where untouchables or chandalas live. Food offered in rituals is regarded as defiled if even seen by a chandala. Sacrificial vessels are rendered impure by their touch, and some of the texts group them with animals. It is true that there have been changes at a very slow pace. The impact of legislation, urban life, democracy, freedom, equality, feminism are transforming age-old attitudes and practices. And the modern era is also witness to increasing political self-awareness among the so-called untouchables and their readiness to organize themselves to agitate for human rights and for justice. But it's also true that laws in India prohibiting caste discrimination are very poorly administered. And so the phenomena of untouchability persists in contemporary India and elsewhere. And Hindus, too many Hindus, continue to define the meaning of Hindu identity over and against those who are deemed unequal and polluting, and for this reason, marginalized. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar was born in 1891 into what is called the Mahar caste, one of the largest untouchable castes in the Indian state of Maharashtra. I urge you to read his writings, his works. As a child, he experienced the humiliation of being an untouchable in many, many forms. For example, barbers refused to cut his hair, cart drivers would not transport him, teachers denied him the opportunity to study Sanskrit, forced him to sit at the back of the class, refused to touch his books. But with amazing perseverance, Ambedkar became the first untouchable to enter university, graduating from Elphinstone College in 1908 with a degree in economics and political science. And with a scholarship from the state of Baroda, he attended Columbia University in New York, where he completed a master's degree and then a Ph.D. in economics. He also studied at the London School of Economics, where he earned a DSc in econ, and was also admitted to the British bar as an attorney. Upon his return to India, Ambedkar devoted himself to combating the injustices of caste and untouchability, eventually rising to become independent India's first law minister and chairman of the drafting committee for the Constitution of India. It's an unbelievable biography. Eventually, he resigned from the cabinet of Jawaharlal Nehru because of a controversy surrounding the Hindu Code Bill. But he was appointed to India's upper house, the Rajya Sabha, until his death in December 1956 at the age of 65. In 1935, December 1935, an anti-caste group, the Jatpat Todak Mandal, invited Dr. Ambedkar to deliver the presidential address at the annual conference, which was scheduled to meet the following year in Lahore. This is, of course, pre-independence. He consented to preside at the conference, but then there was a long and interesting exchange between Dr. Ambedkar and the organizers about his text, the text of his lecture, and especially about the printing of the text. The Mandal insisted on printing the text in Lahore, and Dr. Ambedkar wanted this to happen in Mumbai, where he resided. The real issue, as he suspected and later on, of course, he confirmed, was the wish on the part of the Mandal to see his text before he delivered this lecture. And after he shared his text with the organizers, they expressed very serious reservations about certain sections and asked him to expunge these. They were troubled by his announcement in this lecture itself of his decision to change his religion, to embrace the Buddhist tradition, and his call to discard the authority of the Shastras, or Hindu sacred texts. In fact, he spoke about destroying the religion of the Shastras. So, it would not surprise you that Dr. Ambedkar refused to purge his text of any passages that others found to be offensive. He would not alter, as he said, even a comma in his text. And this lecture is the basic content of what I regard as his most important work on caste, because it was eventually published as The Annihilation of Caste. And today, as his editor, S. Anand, notes, it's printed and reprinted, but read primarily by Dalits. It has, he says, the curious distinction of being one of the most obscure, as well as one of the most widely read books in India. I mention this because my talk today draws in a very special way broadly from Dr. Ambedkar's writings, but in a very special way from this very seminal critique of the caste system. So there are three reasons for my focus on his writings on caste, and especially on this text, The Annihilation of Caste. I think that it remains the most passionate, insightful, and incisive critique of the caste system from a very brilliant mind who personally experienced its violence and its injustice as an impediment to human dignity and to human flourishing. I think his value as a testimony is an enduring one. Second, and I'll develop this a little bit in my presentation, I think Dr. Ambedkar's critique of caste remains as relevant today as it was when it was published over 83 years ago. Unfortunately, there are many in the Hindu world who still offer arguments to justify some version of the caste system. Many of these arguments were anticipated and engaged and refuted by Dr. Ambedkar in his writings. But Hindus they're not paid attention to what he has to say. And thirdly, I think, his address is a very radical challenge to the Hindu tradition and its ideals. As he wrote, "If I am disgusted with Hindus and Hinduism, it is because I am convinced that they cherish wrong ideals and live a wrong social life. My quarrel with Hindus and Hinduism is not over the imperfection of their social conduct. It is much more fundamental. It is over their ideals." End of quote. He challenged the tradition to show that it was able to articulate a doctrinal basis, and I quote also, that will be consonant with liberty, equality, and fraternity, in short, with democracy. So what was his critique? Two important points of clarification that he made and he considered important. In making his case for dismantling the annihilation of caste, as he calls it, he distinguished himself in his own time from the political reformers and the socialists, in fact, of his day, with arguments, I think, that still speak across time to societies dealing with structural injustice. So there were those who argued that, we should focus only on constitutional change and political reform. This was separate from the transformation of the social order, of social structures. But Ambedkar argued very strongly for their inseparability. Political reforms, he said, that ignore and leave unaddressed structural inequalities are limited. In his words, I quote, "The emancipation of the mind and the soul is a necessary preliminary for the political expansion of the people." To the socialists of his time who, were arguing, who championed the Marxist theory of economic determinism, Ambedkar cautioned them about hasty generalizations based on European models and argued for greater complexity in our understanding of the sources of power. These include property, so he was not naive about that, but he included religion and social status, among others. In Ambedkar's views, economic reform does not always guarantee changes in these relationships. And so I quote him again: "If the source of power and dominion is at any given time or in any given society social and religious, then social and religious reform must be accepted as a necessary sort of reform." So in addition to engaging political and social reformers, socialists, Ambedkar also had to contend with arguments of those who defended the caste system. And many of those arguments, continue today to be advanced in one form or another. And so I want to selectively highlight some of those as articulated in our own times. I collect some of these arguments, and it's always important to see how these arguments continue to be made today, even though I think, Dr. Ambedkar so effectively countered them and highlighted their fallacies in his own time. So the first one is what I call the division of labor argument. This is the argument that, is used to defend the system, that caste is a division of labor, and this division of labor is a feature of every society. In other words, those who proffer this argument want to treat it as somehow normal and natural. So let me just quote a recent articulation of this argument. I don't mention the writer. Most of these are living people writing about the system. So I'm quoting now. "People everywhere divide themselves up into castes. We have workers, you go to work, you work under somebody else. That happens all over the world. That's the Shudra caste. We have merchants who are self-motivated. That's the Vaishya caste. We have the politicians and lawmakers and the law enforcement people. That's the Kshatriya caste. And then you have the priests, the ministers, the missionaries. That's the Brahmin caste. Every society has these castes working within it in one way or another. In today's world, if one is not fulfilling the dharma of his born caste, then he changes caste. For instance, if a Brahmin husband and wife are working 8 to 15 hours a day in a hospital under others, they are no longer of the Brahmin caste. They are no longer performing the duties of that caste. They are workers, the Shudra caste." End of quote. Ambedkar addresses such arguments, not in this explicit formulation, but the division of labor argument, as I put it, reminding us that caste is not merely a division of labor. In his famous words, it is a division of laborers. It is not just a division of labor, it is a division of laborers. And that's an important division. This division is not as innocuous as the quote above suggests. It is hierarchical, it is unequal, it is based on norms of purity and impurity. So this argument that it's a natural division of labor that we find universally, it's a very troubling argument, and I think needs to be vigorously contested as Dr. Ambedkar did. The second argument, I label it, so the first is the division of labor argument, the second is the is related, I call it the universality of caste argument. And this one also seeks, all of these seek to minimize the oppressive nature of caste, in this case, by citing its existence among Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. So here is a contemporary articulation of this argument, and I quote, "It is rarely observed that the social hierarchy is not just limited to Hinduism, but it stays intact in any Indian religious society. Buddhists, Jainas, Sikhs, Christians, Muslims have their own caste hierarchies and restrictions. Even Western societies have their own classes and groups. Thus, it is indeed a social phenomenon which is not just limited to Hinduism or India." So Dr. Ambedkar, in his writings, he doesn't question the reality of caste in other communities, but he says, but there are still very important and critical differences. The most important among these is that the other traditions have not treated caste as a sacred order. It doesn't find the same depth of religious argument legitimized by appeal to religion. So for him, as he says, it's a dangerous delusion to take comfort in the mere existence of caste among non-Hindus. And I'm not sure, I don't know what is the significance of citing the existence of caste across religious communities. Is no comfort to those who are crushed by its oppressive weight. I mean, how do the oppressed receive this argument when it is made in this way? Well, oppression is universal. It's not a constructive or helpful argument. The third argument that I want to mention is what I call the character versus the birth argument. This is probably the most widespread Hindu argument that is given to somehow legitimize this social order. So the argument here is that this division, this social division, this Chatur Varna, as we say, the fourfold division of society, is based on individual psychological differences, what would be called in Sanskrit as guna or guna bheda, are not on birth, not on janma, but really it's a psychological ordering of human beings. So this defense of caste upholds the fourfold classification of human beings, but says, but it's on the basis of individual disposition. It is an argument that is associated in a very special way with the reformist Arya Samaj movement founded by Swami Dayananda Saraswati in the 19th century. But here is a contemporary articulation of it by a Hindu monk. The Varna system, he says, I'm quoting, was based on a person's characteristics, temperament, and their innate nature. The Vedas describe one's nature as being a mixture of the three gunas, and the three gunas here, tamas, rajas, and sattva. Depending on the relative proportion of each of these gunas, one would be classified as Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra. These gunas are not inherited. They are based on one's inherent nature and one's karma. Therefore, one's varna was also not supposed to be based on heredity, and in the past it was not. End of quote. In spite of the supposed merit-based, in spite of its supposed merit-based argument, Ambedkar contested this defense of caste with great insight and acuity. And I think his arguments need to be heard by all those today who uncritically envisage a guna version ordering of human society. And as I said, this is a very popular representation of the caste order that doesn't at all engage Dr. Ambedkar's sharp critique that he gave over 80 years ago is the most popular defense of caste in numerous variations. So I just want to select a few of, Dr. Ambedkar gave a lot of attention to this argument. I just want to retrieve a few of the prominent ones. So first, he sees it as a very naive argument because he interrogates the necessity. So this division is based on the employment of certain labels, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya labels. And for him, these names, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, are names that have long associated with a definite and fixed notion in the minds of Hindus. That is based on notions of hierarchy, based on birth. And as long as these names he feels are retained, the hierarchies that are connected with these names, the hierarchy of higher and lower, which are so deeply embedded in them, will persist. In other words, to put it simply, you cannot have caste labels without caste hierarchies and attendant inequality. So he feels that those who argue along those lines are really, really deluded and naive. The second argument, as I would say, is a more pragmatic argument. And he asks, how are you going to compel people who have acquired higher status based on birth without reference to their worth to vacate their status? If you say, we should order this whole thing on the basis of merit, how are you going to persuade those who have acquired higher status based on birth? Will they ever recognize as equal, he asks, those who are currently classified as lower on the basis of birth, but who deserve higher status on the basis of worth? In addition, how will such a system be maintained? What will be the sanctions for transgression? What happens to the women in this system? Are they classified on the basis of the worth, on their own worth, or do they assume the varna of their husbands, and so on? Third, his third objection, I think, is to the very ideal of a fourfold classification of human beings. And here he argues for human diversity, richness, flexibility, which all make it impossible to classify human beings in four groups. He says that this fourfold classification, Chaturvarna, must fail for the very reason, he says, for the very reason that Plato's Republic must fail. Namely, it is not possible to pigeonhole human beings into these four categories. And fourthly, and this final argument I'm going to give with you, he feels that such a classification, Chaturvarna, makes groups unreasonably dependent on each other for the fulfillment of vital needs. Groups suffer when other groups don't pursue their own vocations or obligations, or fail to fulfill their responsibilities to other groups. The Shudra, says Ambedkar, is particularly vulnerable in this system since he's prohibited from wealth and knowledge and the means to defend himself or herself. So he argues, education everybody must have. Why it must be a privilege? Means of defense everyone should have. Wealth everyone should have. These are paramount requirements for every human being for self-preservation. How is the fact of someone's neighbor being educated helps the one who is not allowed access to education? Now, in enunciating the principles that are necessary for the flourishing of any human community, so I'm going from critique to constructive part of my talk, Dr. Ambedkar highlighted, and he speaks about these values throughout his writings, he highlighted liberty, equality, and fraternity, terms with which you will be familiar. All of these, he argued, were absent in the Hindu tradition. Of the three principles necessary for human flourishing, liberty, equality, and fraternity, Dr. Ambedkar gave pride of place to fraternity as sustaining both liberty and equality. He equated fraternity with what the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, spoke of as Maitri. Maitri. And in fact, he said, I prefer the Sanskrit term Maitri than fraternity. He believed that fraternity had its roots in a religious worldview. He was convinced that caste injustice and oppression were intrinsic to the Hindu tradition. And so he wrote that the Hindu social order, I quote, refuses to recognize that men, no matter how profoundly they differ as individuals in capacity and character, are equally entitled as human beings to considerations and respect, and that the well-being of a society is likely to be increased if it so plans its organization that whether their powers are great or small, all members must be equally enabled to make the best of such powers as they possess. So he felt that the tradition does not allow equality of circumstances, institutions, and manner of life. It is against what he says, what he calls the egalitarian temper. Now, before concluding his address, which eventually, as I said, became the book, the important document, The Annihilation of Caste, and announcing his departure from the Hindu tradition and his embrace of Buddhism, he described what he saw as a challenge before Hindu society. He challenged the Hindu tradition to articulate principles for human flourishing. And this is, I quote, this paragraph from the end of that lecture. He says, "You must give a new doctrinal basis to your religion, a basis that will be in consonance with liberty, equality, and fraternity, in short, with democracy. I am no authority on the subject, but I am told that for such principles as will be consonant with liberty, equality, and fraternity, it may not be necessary for you to borrow from foreign sources, and that you could draw for such principles on the Upanishads." This is Ambedkar. "Whether you could do so without a complete remolding, a considerable scraping and chipping off from the ore they contain is more than I can say. This means a complete change in the fundamental notions of life. It means a complete change in the values of life. It means a complete change in outlook and an attitude towards men and things," end of quote. This is where he sort of ended his lecture. The task that he described, it was not one that he felt it was his obligation to undertake. And so, as I said, in 1956, on October 14th, was a very important day in the city of Nagpur, the state of Maharashtra. Ambedkar and thousands converted to Buddhism. And the following day, he delivered an address in the city explaining his reasons. Tragically, 7 weeks after his conversion, Dr. Ambedkar passed away at the age of 64. He was clearly disillusioned and pessimistic, as his writings show, about the possibilities for reform and rejuvenation within the Hindu tradition. But in that paragraph that I quoted for you, there's one interesting point that he makes. And I read again. He says, "I am told that for such principles as will be consonant with liberty, equality, and fraternity, it may not be necessary for you to borrow from foreign sources, and that you could draw for such principles on the Upanishads." It was a very interesting statement to me. What was he speaking about? What are there such principles? Where does he see the light of hope in the doctrines of the Hindu tradition that could provide ground for human dignity and equality? In an essay titled "Brahma is not Dharma, What God is Brahma," Dr. Ambedkar grants that the Hindu tradition offered a teaching with redemptive possibilities. He calls this, in this essay, he names this teaching Brahmaism, not Brahminism, but Brahmaism. And he says, and I quote, that it had greater potentialities for producing social democracy than the idea of fraternity. And he spoke about the Upanishads, as I mentioned. He locates the source of this teaching in the Upanishadic texts. And he cites certain texts, maybe some of you are familiar with these. He cites the text from the Chandogya Upanishad, Tattvamasi, that thou art, which that thou art is a text speaking of the identity of the divine self with the human self. He cites the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad text, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, as well as the Chandogya Upanishad text, Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma. So what Dr. Ambedkar describes as Brahmaism is the teaching that affirms the identity between the human self and the divine reality, the identity between Atma and Brahma. That's one thing. And secondly, it identifies also that this divine reality is the reality that is the essence of everything. He welcomed the possibility, the theological possibility that was embedded in this teaching, the affirmation of human worth that he saw as potential in this Upanishadic insight about the identity between the human and the divine self. In fact, he went on to say, it is not an arrogant assertion. One can't say, because one can't say, I alone am that. The teaching is that everyone, this is an inclusive theological affirmation of human identity with divine reality. And in fact, he said that this teaching affirming the equal worth and value of every human being theologically could provide a strong foundation for democracy. And I quote, if all persons are parts of the divine, parts of Brahma, then all are equal and all must enjoy the same liberty, which is what democracy means, end of quote. But the problem that Dr. Ambedkar correctly saw also is the failure to connect such potentially transformative teaching with social reality, to return to society, as he says, as instruments of reconstructing society. And in fact, he chastises one of India's foremost teachers, the great Adi Shankaracharya, for perpetuating this great chasm between theology and social reality, between teaching and social structures. And so he says, what is more ridiculous is the teaching of the great Shankaracharya. First, it was this Shankaracharya who taught that there is Brahma, and this Brahma is real and pervades all. And at the same time, he upheld the inequities of the caste system, of Brahmin society. So this is the dilemma. He was not optimistic, and for good reasons, about the ability of Hindu society to transform itself. Because those who have to undertake the transformation are in some ways those who benefit from the social hierarchy. So I think no one can deny, and no one should even dream of denying Dr. Ambedkar's experience of the Hindu tradition as based on graded inequality. His intuition about the Upanishads as sources of principles for re-envisioning and reforming Hindu society, I think is correct. I think it does, I believe that it does offer a teaching that has the potential, even though Dr. Ambedkar was not optimistic. He didn't think that it was his responsibility to do this work. But I share his belief that the Upanishads offer what I would call a theological basis for the equal worth and dignity of all human beings, and the refutation of the assumptions of inequality, impurity, indignity that are at the foundations of caste. This teaching is there, that he identified this teaching, which I think, can be an antidote to any effort to deny personhood, worth, and dignity of another. One can't give if one takes this. I think if one takes this teaching very seriously, and it becomes a lens through which one evaluates social structures, you cannot give your assent or support to any social or cultural system that is founded on human inequality and indignity. So, I mean, we require diligence and discernment in identifying such systems and articulating critiques from these places of meaning. I want to conclude, because I've gone on now for quite a while, and look forward to your discussion. I think connecting theology with life, which is what Ambedkar in some ways was demanding of the Hindu tradition and its teachers, requires that we expand our understanding of human suffering, requires a lot of transformation in interpretation of Hindu theology. The traditional emphasis has been on suffering as an inward condition associated with spiritual ignorance or avidya. But we must not ignore, we can't. We have to have a much more extensive understanding of dukkha, of suffering. We can't ignore the suffering of human beings when they lack opportunities to attain the necessities for dignified and decent living, or when suffering is, as we see, inflicted through oppression and injustice based on caste and gender and race. We can't speak of doctrines of life unity while being indifferent to inequality and to structural injustice. So we have to identify these structures and we have to work to overcome. But we will, my final point, in the Hindu tradition, we need to acknowledge the reality of injustice, past and present. We need to be more self-critical and less defensive, to hold our tradition accountable. Citing the injustices of other traditions does not justify or excuse those existing within our own tradition. And perhaps most important, we need to be attentive to the voice of those who experience and continue to experience this tradition as oppressive and unjust, and denying them dignity, power, and freedom. We have to hear their truths, however challenging and difficult this is. In the absence of such acknowledgement, we will continue to perpetuate teachings and structures that inflict suffering. So I think Dr. Ambedkar presents a very powerful and relevant challenge to the Hindu tradition, one that I hope I'm not naive about this, that we can learn to take very, very seriously. I think it will be better, much, much better human beings for listening to Dr. Ambedkar, for studying him, and for engaging his critique of the Hindu tradition. So I will stop there, Sruta Kirti, and we can have a few comments from your group.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking on this topic, and so well, and in depth. That was, I had a chance to read your chapter from Hindu Theology of Liberation, but I didn't get around to reading Annihilation of Caste. I'm familiar with it, but I think that that's definitely one of those things that I need to get around to reading. But Just for everyone who's attending, feel free to use the chat function to put in your questions, but also just unmute and jump in with questions if you
You
have.
can turn your cameras on.
Yeah, I mean, if you want
You're
to,
not,
please turn your cameras
you're
on.
not tired for me, so I want to see you a little bit.
Okay. Do we have any questions?
Or comments, it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be.
Yeah.
I want to learn from you also what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I have a comment and question. My name is Suraj. Excellent presentation, Professor Rambachan.
Thank you, Suraj.
I've not heard such presentation, especially from the Hindu theological perspective, in a long time or even ever. Especially because of the limitations you point out, is to have a very knee-jerk reaction and to engage in whataboutery of in standing in defense of this.
Yes,
I was, um, Ambedkar's biography really talks about, he is actually trying to reform Hinduism. Many people do not credit him for that. He actually devotes much of the time invested, and it's not his job. It's the job of
yes,
people who are on the dominant plane, and
yes,
he takes his time. But also, then he thinks Hindus are irreparable because I've been trying to tell them to reform, and you have cited his invocation of Upanishad, and also and then eventually he ends up writing about the riddles in
yes,
in
yes,
Hinduism,
yes,
and kind of bringing out the human aspect of Rama, Krishna, in a way that gets deified, and obviously we know the tradition of Rama or Krishna or anybody. Each caste group has their own interpretation. Rama
yes,
Ramayana has written more than 200. I think A.K. Ramanujan has written about this. And so with Krishna sometimes is a Baniya god, but sometimes a Shudra a god, and we kind of have that multiplicity, and it's very interesting that a certain Savarna perspective only gets across
yes,
the board.
yes,
I was talking to a Professor Kancha Ilaiah, who wrote Why I'm Not a Hindu,
yes,
and with him there was his colleague who actually interpreted Krishna as the Shudra, Shudra leader, and how the other kind of mischief added is to, so that's when we thought there was like huge diversity in how we think also
yes,
about about Hinduism. My question to you is maybe in two part is, when you are advocating such viewpoint, which is in a liberation theological perspective, how or what is the response you are receiving from various quarters? One is obviously the protector of Hindu Dharma, so-called RSS, VHP, and the
mhm,
right-wing fundamentalists. How do they treat you? And then obviously there are people who might be liberal Hindus, but still want to hold on to caste because they don't know anything better.
yes,
They don't know that can it exist, and so there is a lot. And I go to many conversations trying to talk about caste. I wrote a book called Caste Matters, and within that perspective, what we see is dominant caste children are illiterate about caste because they reap the benefits of caste, and unknowingly it's very much in their parents indoctrinate them without really critical inquiry, and that's why you see fundamentalism kind of. So the reaction, so how do you get reaction? That's kind of one part of question. And second, the Ambedkar's prescription of reforming or suggesting Hinduism, also in annihilation of caste and various others, has the Hindu community, more specifically Brahmin, because they are the controllers of Hindu narrative, taken on board? Do you have any idea about any of the Pete or any of the sittings of Shankaracharyas to, like, listen, this guy has tried to do something, instead of rejecting him, let's try to, because unlike Christianity, which had Protestant kind of revival, we don't see that possibility. So the question is, like Judeo-Christian guilt, is there a Hindu guilt?
yeah,
And to my experience, I've not seen Hindu guilt. I've seen shoving of responsibility on
mhm,
others. What about others? What about others?
yeah.
Yeah.
No, Suraj, thank you very much. First of all, I'm honored that you joined our discussion this evening, and I read your book on caste matters, and thank you very much for that. I just want to affirm what you said, and before I come to your questions, one is that I regard, many people don't pay enough attention to all of the serious theological work that Dr. Ambedkar did. He was a very, very ardent and dedicated scholar of religion. And of course, his writings on religion are very extensive. He gave a lot of attention to, because he saw religion as significant, as I said before, as far as social reform is concerned. I took a look, Suraj, at, as you said, Dr. Ambedkar also wrote a lot on the Bhagavadgita. I took a look at, not long ago, at all of the post-independence commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita written by Hindus in India, because I wanted to see, knowing how prominent Dr. Ambedkar was and how important, how significant a scholar he was. I want to see if any of these commentaries would at all respond to him or engage his critique. And it's sad to say, I didn't find a single one citing Dr. Ambedkar or anything that he wrote on the caste, even in the commentaries, on those passages on caste that are there in the sacred text. No, was complete, sadly, Suraj, it wouldn't surprise you, complete indifference or ignoring of his critique. And I think, it sort of verifies his own pessimism, in a sense, that about the willingness of the tradition to engage seriously with this caste matter. On the question of, what the response is, among the conservative Hindus, I published this work that Sruto Kirti mentioned, a Hindu Theology of Liberation, in which I'm trying to develop liberation theology from a Hindu perspective, inspired by the work of, liberation theologians, and especially African American liberation theologians like James Cone and others. So, it's either indifference, it's not attracted much attention in those circles, but where among the conservatives, they respond with anger. That's all I can say. They are very angry about it, because they find it very, very difficult, as you mentioned, where we have a tradition of, many other traditions have developed this very important tradition of self-criticism, self-critical theology, that does not undermine commitment, but at the same time, it's not a naive commitment. Commitment has to also involve, especially where a tradition has a history of such oppression. You have to do theology in that tradition with a deep sense of self-criticism, and that's not there among those groups. Now, I spent some time, with these arguments that I named in the first part of my lecture, Suraj, because these arguments are still offered by those who consider themselves liberal Hindus. To still find or think that there is something ironic in this system, that there was some noble intention in this system. They still want to hold on to this golden age nobility about the system, and are not willing to admit also, which I think is fundamental, that Hindus are as flawed and as subject to corruption as any other as other human beings, and that we have been oppressive. We are not exempt from the weaknesses of human nature, and we will trample on others to lift ourselves. But I think that you know, liberal Hindus have to come to the place of understanding that there's no argument that you can give. There's no ironic argument. There's no innocuous argument for this system. We have to simply, as Dr. Ambedkar says, annihilate it. It has to be annihilated, and that's the way. That's the way forward. We here in the United States, you know, we have, it's a struggling organization. It's called Sadhana. We speak of it as a voice of progressive Hinduism. It's a lot of younger people trying to advocate for a Hindu tradition that is addresses the issues of structural injustice, social hierarchies. I hope may not happen in my own lifetime. I support this organization. I advise them. I hope that it emerges into a meaningful voice for a progressive Hindu tradition. But as Dr. Ambedkar said, Suraj, you know, those who benefit from structures of power are not the ones who are willing to dismantle it. With the same issue with racism here in the United States. And I think, you know, casteism and racism intersect in so many significant ways. And that's why we have to form partnerships with those who are working across the board to dismantle structures of oppression. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here. Appreciate it very much.
Any other like immediate questions? Because I actually do have one.
Okay.
So unless someone wants to go, I'm gonna jump the queue. It's really I'm really glad that you actually brought up I guess the ways in which the structures of caste oppression and racial oppression intersect, because you know, recently Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste has just come out, and it's opened up a lot of discourse on and you know, I mean, it's been heavily praised but also heavily criticized for, I guess, like the central question seems to be how useful is the, like, you know, is caste as an analytical category to also understand race and vice versa. And you know, what is your opinion on that? Like, do you think that they are, like, you know, they can inform like how we view each of those oppressions, or do you think that sometimes it can obscure and pull terminologies from specific context and appropriate them where they're not, where they don't, you know, where they're not relevant?
No, I read Isabel's book, Soto Could Be, and personally, you know, I of course also saw some of the criticism of the book, and there's some, you know, there are some very silly criticism of her work as well, you know. So for example, I don't know sometimes how to describe these. Some people would say, you know, the word caste is not a Sanskrit word. There is no caste system because we don't have the word. We don't have the word caste, you know. So what she's writing about, you know, is not about she can't be writing about the Hindu word because she's using terminology that is not, you know, native or indigenous. I think that if one, and as I do, I look at the larger context of her argument and the way in which she delineates certain common features of Varna and race. I think that's where the heart of her work is, that these structures of these oppressive structures have certain fundamental similarities. They share certain common, they structurally overlap, and she goes, you know, she lists the ways in which this happens. You know, so what is caste and what is race? Basically, one is it's an unequal ordering of human beings. You know, so it's on the basis of which privilege are assigned. You assign privilege on the basis of a fundamental hierarchical ordering of human beings. So in the case of race, you know, you had theories of you know, based on color of skin and so on. and it's at heart hierarchical. Caste is hierarchical, and then privilege and rewards are assigned. So basically, one's economic studies of caste in India has also continued to show, that those who are the millions and millions at the lower rungs of the caste order suffer. I mean, they're economically deprived. It's a continuing issue as it is with race. So I think that at that place of argument, I found the thesis to be appealing and illuminating in terms of linking two important historical structures of oppression in the Indian subcontinent and here in the United States. I mean, people can quibble with, either she get all of the characteristics of caste right or not. That's where I've seen a lot of the criticism comes. But I think the bigger purpose of the work is I found the discussion to be meaningful.
No, definitely. Yeah, I think probably structurally it definitely has, you can only add to our certain analysis. Okay, well, I mean, I don't want to take up too much space, but so please, everyone, jump in or raise your hand or something if you've got questions or comments. Yeah, go on to the.
Yes, please.
I have not taken any formal education.
I can't hear you very well. Sorry.
Am I audible now?
No, I'm not hearing very well. I'm not sure if it's on my side or.
Hello. I'm audible now. Hello.
Sorry,
Shruti, are you hearing him?
No, I think the sound is just a bit low and it's a bit muffled. Maybe you could try typing out your question if that's easy.
Yeah.
Sorry, I would like to hear you very much, but I'm having difficulty.
Well, in the meanwhile, then I'll just add in another question I had. You talk about this idea of Ambedkar also, saying that you don't to find a liberation philosophy, you don't need to look to foreign sources. And I guess I was also thinking about how his anti-caste politics relates to his anti-colonial practices as well, and really anti-caste, placing anti-casteism as the colonial practice. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, especially relevant to, I guess, the current context of Dalit movements in India, which are fairly big in university campuses, but also more generally in the public sphere, that position themselves as these really radical movements that do advocate for anti-caste politics, but are also position themselves as decolonial. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So first, Shruti, one of the reasons why, and I think this is important, that there are many reasons why Dr. Ambedkar embraced the Buddhist tradition. He became Buddhist in a public conversion because he wanted to identify with the Indian religious tradition. He didn't want to identify with a tradition that was not out of the Indian soil. And he found, in his understanding of Buddhism, he found that the Buddhist tradition had, core teachings that he believed affirmed human dignity and human equality. So, he was not anti-national. He was very much anti-caste, but not anti-national. Secondly, he was very deeply involved in the movement for independence. He had very strong differences with some of the leaders, and his debates with Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. His debates are well known. His differences are well known, and especially about reservations, issue of voting, and reservations. But I think, his anti-colonial commitments were as strong as his anti-caste concerns. And so he was very critical of all the economic, because he was as you know, he was an economist also, so he understood, he understood colonial structures, and he understood colonial structures and the economic devastation of India that was wrought as a consequence of, the exploitation of its resources. So, my general comment is yes. He certainly, his anti-caste was not at all at the expense of his commitment to the well-being and the flourishing of all of Indian society. Did you? Okay, you didn't type your question.
I think maybe he's still.
Oh, it's there now. So thank you, Chetan, for that. I think it's a question about the origin of caste, which is, as I said, it's a lot of different theories. Even Dr. Ambedkar had his own views on it. People were differentiated on the basis of occupation. So the question is, then what happened? Why did, to just, clarify your question, why did we had the fact of the hereditary factor then becoming associated with occupational differentiation? So you had, and which one can say, is because in the absence, Chetan, we can speculate, in the absence of a system of universal education, it was quite common in many ancient societies, Asian and European, for occupations to be transmitted within families, because that was the only place where, where most people could learn what it meant to be a blacksmith, or somebody working in leather, or so on and so forth. So, but this system, in addition to its hereditary dimension, that one is born into a caste and one inherits the work of one's family in that caste, then you had also caste at heart. It is a hereditary system, but it is also based on certain notions of purity and impurity. Right, so that's also a fundamental characteristic of caste, and this is why you have the phenomena of untouchability. That's a consequence of a system of purity and impurity. In Sanskrit, we translate it as asprishya, the one who is not to be touched. And because of the belief that the other is impure, is ashuddha, and by touching, there's a sort of a contamination of one's own purity. And so clearly, then you had, I think, the appeal to religious arguments to legitimize the system. Sadly, even today, such arguments are used. And Chetan, I'm thinking in particular of the ways in which Hindu teachings on karma have been appropriated and for a long time and used to justify this social order, in the sense that, that your birth is a consequence of past actions, or karma, as we would say. And therefore, if you are born into a particular family, in a particular social context, it has to be as a consequence of, actions in the past. Therefore, the teaching is used to legitimize the status quo, rather than to interrupt it or to question it. So we have to, we can't, it's impossible to trace exactly, when these doctrines became part of the argument for caste, but there's no doubt that, they are very much a part of the rationale that those who defend the caste system will give. And that's why I think, in my lecture, I'm trying to say that part of the work for the annihilation of caste, as Dr. Ambedkar himself so quite rightly said, has to be theological. And I wish there could be a clear consensus on the part of prominent Hindu leaders that this system is, I would say, it is at heart dissonant from what I regard as the core affirmations of the Hindu tradition.
There's another question in the comment section. It says, could you please talk a bit about Gramsci's notion of hegemony and how Brahminical structures, cultures, ideologies, etc. get legitimacy among the Dalits, Adivasis, and Bahujans of India?
Mhm. Well, I think that part of the problem, Yash, as you describe it, is that, and if you read, Suraj had earlier on referenced the work of Kanchan Ilaya, who wrote a book, Why I Am Not Hindu. And in this work, part of his purpose in this work is to also argue that these groups, like the Adivasis, the Bahujans, and so on, had also their own distinctive rituals, had their own distinctive understandings of the nature of the divine and what it meant, to live life meaningfully. And that there has been this with the rise of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, there is also, an attempt to bring these groups under the larger umbrella of the Hindu tradition. And in doing that also, what happens is that the uniqueness of their distinctive worldviews and distinctive practices gradually get erased. And I think that, it's very sad. But what happens is that, and it's not an easy matter, because we see this happening here also. We've seen this historically happening in the context of race in the United States. If you read, for example, the work of, say, someone like Malcolm X, if you read his autobiography, you'll see how he, at one stage of his life, he, in order to gain acceptance and legitimacy, as you said, he sought to become white, to become a white person, to conceal and to erase his Black identity, because as a young man, it's hard to deal with, to live in a society where your basic worth and integrity is so blatantly denied in the structure in which you live. And so he spoke about the attractiveness of trying to become like his oppressors, to gain self-value, to gain acceptance. And eventually, of course, he writes of how much pain that it caused him. And then is, of course, his embrace of what he regarded as authentic African selfhood. So I would not be, surprised that what you describe is also happening with marginalized groups elsewhere. In order to gain legitimacy, they seek to absorb, those practices and those beliefs that they think might have higher social and theological value. But I think it's something that is, it's something to be regretted, because it's a diminishing of diversity. And what we need to learn is not to seek to make everyone like us, but to seek to celebrate the diversity that's a part of all of our societies.
Well, if there aren't any questions, I guess we could conclude by just, talking a bit about where these studies are happening. Obviously, like, in the, right now there's a big explosion of Dalit studies literature, but it's also true that a lot of that scholarship is happening outside of India. And obviously, there are big, South Asian diasporas all over the world, and also in the West. But I guess I'm wondering at the sort of implications of doing research like liberationists, for liberation purposes, or maybe I don't know why people are doing that research, but supposedly for liberation purposes, what, is there like a contention there that the scholarship is being done in these institutions that themselves maybe aren't liberationist? Yeah, I guess we could just sort of problematize like the locations through which we also function when we're having these conversations and doing this work.
Mhm.
Also, anyone who has any comments on that, feel free to jump in.
If there's nothing, I just wanted to also thank you, Shruti, for inviting me to spend this time with all of you. And so I appreciate the opportunity very much. I appreciate the few comments and responses, the dialogue we had. And I want to also wish all of you well in your studies. And I hope you stay safe and stay healthy during these very difficult times that we are going through.
Well, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. But yeah, I'll just end the recording here.